A Tennessee death row inmate sentence is carried out by electrocution. Nicholas Sutton pronounced dead at 8:26 p.m. at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. His death sentence coming from the 1985 killing of fellow inmate Carl Estep at the Morgan County Regional Correctional Facility. At the time, Sutton was already serving a life sentence for killing his grandmother and two other men in North Carolina. WAT 6 On Your Side reporter Elizabeth Kubel has been at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution hearing tonight from people who witnessed Sutton's execution.
After spending the last 33 years of his life here on death row, this is where Nicholas Sutton took his final breath. Selected media members witnessing his death by electrocution Thursday night and recounting what they saw.
The death chamber at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution was silent on the evening of February 20th, 2020. The smell of disinfectant hung heavy in the air as guards moved with precision, fastening thick leather straps across the arms and chest of a man who had lived on death row for more than 3 decades. His name was Nicholas Todd Sutton. At just 58 years old, his hair had turned gray, and the violent young man who once terrorized East Tennessee now looked more like a weary grandfather. Yet on this night, he was about to face one of the most feared punishments in American history, the electric chair. As the heavy helmet was lowered over his head and the copper electrodes pressed against his shaven scalp, Sutton did not beg or curse. Instead, in a calm voice that carried across the chamber, he said, "I'm just grateful to be a servant of Jesus Christ, and I want to thank my family and friends who have loved me." Witnesses later described how the room filled with an eerie stillness, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the final moment to arrive. But behind the straps and the quiet words was a story far more complicated than a simple execution. Sutton was a convicted murderer, guilty of killing 4 people, including his own grandmother. He was, by every legal definition, a killer. Yet over the years, inside the very prison walls that were meant to contain him, he had saved lives, protected guards, and earned the loyalty of men who would later plead for his execution to be stopped. So, who was Nicholas Todd Sutton, the cold-blooded murderer who once stabbed a fellow inmate 38 times because he was a child molester, or the reformed man prison guards described as a hero? And why, despite dozens of pleas from corrections officers, family members, and even jurors who once sentenced him, did Tennessee push forward with his death? Long before he became known as the man strapped into Tennessee's electric chair, Nicholas Todd Sutton was just a boy growing up in the hills of Morristown, Tennessee. Born on July 15, 1961, his life began under a shadow that would follow him for decades. His childhood was not filled with warmth or security, but with instability, neglect, and pain. Sutton's mother abandoned him when he was still young, leaving him in the care of a father who struggled with severe mental illness. That father's battles often spilled over into anger, harsh discipline, and a deep emotional absence that carved scars into Nicholas long before he ever picked up a weapon. Neighbors later recalled him as a restless child, one who longed for affection but rarely received it. School was not a refuge. Sutton bounced in and out of classrooms, often distracted, often in trouble. He was intelligent enough, but he lacked focus and direction. Instead, he found escape in the one thing readily available to him in rural Tennessee during the late 1970s: drugs. By his teenage years, Sutton was already spiraling into addiction. Marijuana and pills came first, then stronger substances. Drugs dulled the ache of abandonment, but they also fueled a darker side: paranoia, aggression, and a hunger for quick money. Despite the instability, there were glimpses of the person he could have been. Teachers noted his charm when he wanted to use it, and friends remembered his easy laugh. He wasn't the type of boy you would expect to one day commit multiple murders, but addiction and chaos rarely leave space for potential. By the time Sutton turned 18, his life was already marked by reckless decisions. He had dropped out of school, surrounded himself with the wrong crowd, and drifted deeper into criminal activity. The most shocking moment came in 1979, when Sutton, still barely an adult, turned on his own grandmother, Dorothy Sutton, a retired teacher. Accounts differ on his motives. Some say it was fueled by greed, others by drug withdrawal. But what is certain is that he killed the very woman who had given him shelter when no one else would. That act, brutal and senseless, shattered any illusion that his troubles were simply those of a misguided teenager. He had crossed a line that would follow him forever. Christmas Day 1979 in Tennessee. While families across Tennessee gathered around tables filled with food and laughter, Nicholas Sutton walked into the Morristown Police Department with a story that instantly raised suspicion. His grandmother, Dorothy Sutton, a retired teacher, was missing. He told officers he had last seen her 3 days earlier, leaving the house with a man he couldn't identify. His words carried just enough worry to sound believable, yet something about his tone seemed off, as though the young man was reciting lines rather than confessing genuine fear. Investigators wasted no time. They drove out to Dorothy's home, expecting to find signs of an elderly woman who had perhaps left in haste. Instead, what they found froze them in their tracks. Blood, drops on the carpet, smears across the wall, dark stains soaked into the wooden floors. The cozy home of a grandmother now resembled a silent crime scene. Detectives returned to Sutton. This time the calm facade began to crack. The questions grew sharper, and so did the unease in his eyes. Finally, he admitted to something far darker than a simple disappearance. In a chilling confession, Sutton said he had stuffed his grandmother's body into a bag, tied it down with a cinder block, and thrown it into the cold, rushing waters of the Nolichucky River. For 2 long days, divers searched the murky depths. The small town waited in grim silence until the truth surfaced. Dorothy's body was recovered, her lifeless frame weighed down at the river's bottom. The autopsy revealed a horrifying detail. She had been struck on the back of the head, and yet she was still alive when she entered the water. Dorothy Sutton had drowned. Her grandson, the man she had once raised and loved, was now her killer in the eyes of the law. His bail was set at $100,000, but his explanations only deepened the horror. Sutton claimed he hadn't killed her at all. He insisted he had come home to find Dorothy dead on the floor and, terrified of being blamed, had panicked. He swore he only disposed of the body. But with blood staining her house and a confession tying him directly to the crime, no one believed him. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Yet even behind bars, Nicholas Todd Sutton could not keep his story straight. Soon he pointed to another man, Charles Pomeroy Allman III, a Knoxville contractor who had mysteriously gone missing months earlier. Sutton now claimed Allman had broken into their home, attacked Dorothy, and forced him into a deadly confrontation. He even said he killed Allman in self-defense before disposing of both bodies in the river. Authorities listened, skeptical but intrigued. After all, Allman's gold Jaguar had been found abandoned outside a Holiday Inn. Could Sutton be telling the truth? Or was this just another desperate attempt to shift the blame? Then came the most shocking revelation of all. Sutton admitted to yet another killing. This time not family, but his childhood friend, 19-year-old John Michael Large. Their friendship had soured over money and drugs, and at a remote North Carolina farm, Sutton claimed an argument turned deadly. He described a violent struggle, gunfire, fists, chains, and finally, a brutal end as he shoved a wooden stick down Large's throat. With Sutton's directions, police unearthed Large's shallow grave in the woods. The autopsy confirmed the beating and the blunt force trauma, but instead of a stick, it was a piece of plywood lodged in his throat. Once again, Sutton's story was close, but twisted. And as for Charles Allman, his body was never found. Each time Sutton opened his mouth, the story shifted. First panic, then self-defense, then bank robberies and accomplices. What emerged was not just a trail of bodies, but a chilling pattern. A man weaving lies as easily as others breathe, leaving behind only doubt, confusion, and a string of the dead. By the spring of 1980, detectives were no longer sifting through rumors. They were unraveling a pattern of death. Nicholas Sutton had already admitted to killing his childhood friend and disposing of his grandmother. But investigators believed the story wasn't finished. They were right. On April 29, 1980, Sutton was formally arraigned in North Carolina, for the murder of John Michael Large. As the legal wheels began to turn, authorities in Tennessee continued searching for Charles Ullman. The missing contractor Sutton claimed had broken into his grandmother's home. For weeks, the trail had gone cold. Then, on May 14th, divers searching an abandoned quarry near Newport made a gruesome discovery. 4 bodies lay at the bottom, preserved in the black water, each one wrapped in plastic, weighed down with cinder blocks, and left to sink into the depths. It was a method investigators now recognized all too well. They called it Sutton's signature. One of the remains was suspected to belong to Ullman. The others, chillingly, were unrelated, strangers who had somehow shared his watery grave. News of the quarry sent shockwaves through the small Tennessee town. And when Sutton heard, his response was as unnerving as it was casual. Without hesitation, he admitted to 2 more killings. One, he claimed, was a teenager from Alcoa he had murdered in July 1978 and buried in North Carolina. The other, a drug buyer from Atlanta, whose body he said still rested beneath the soil of the family farm. Suddenly, the scope of his crimes seemed endless. Investigators launched fresh searches across 2 states, scouring fields, farms, and riverbanks in the hope of finding these so-called victims. Prosecutors even dangled a plea bargain, his life in exchange for the truth. If Sutton led them to the bodies, he would escape the death penalty. But with each dig came only disappointment. No remains, no evidence, no closure. Slowly, investigators realized the horrifying possibility. These new victims had never existed at all. Sutton had fabricated them, weaving lies the same way he had once spun stories about his grandmother and Ullman. Whether out of desperation, manipulation, or some twisted need to stay relevant, he had sent them chasing ghosts. By June 1980, their patience was gone. Sutton was charged with Ullman's murder. Facing the weight of overwhelming evidence, and perhaps realizing his web of lies had finally collapsed, he made a calculated move. To avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to both Ullman's killing and the murder of John Michael Large. When he stood in court for sentencing, the once cocky young man now sounded subdued. He admitted his crimes were acts of anger, reckless decisions that had spiraled out of control. For the first time, there was no shifting blame, no new suspect, no invented victim. Just Nicholas Todd Sutton, accepting the punishment he could no longer escape. The judge handed down 2 additional life sentences. With that, Sutton's fate was sealed. A life once filled with manipulation, violence, and death, now stretched into an endless horizon of prison bars and concrete walls. But the story of Nicholas Sutton didn't end there. Because even behind those walls in the years and decades that followed, his life took a turn no one could have predicted. One that would leave prison guards, fellow inmates, and even the public divided over whether this convicted murderer deserved to die. Nicholas Sutton's life sentence should have marked the end of his trail of blood. Instead, prison walls became the stage for yet another killing. At first, Sutton was sent to Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, a place with its own notorious reputation. Later, he was moved to the maximum security Morgan County Correctional Complex in Wartburg, a cage built to hold men too dangerous for anywhere else. But for Sutton, the change in address did nothing to quiet the darkness inside him. Drugs became his currency. He dealt with them, used them, and in doing so made both allies and enemies. One of those enemies was Carl Estep. Estep was no ordinary inmate. He carried his own monstrous reputation, serving a life sentence for the brutal rape of a 9-year-old girl in Knoxville. Inside prison, he was feared. And when he threatened to kill Sutton with a homemade knife during a drug dispute, the threat carried real weight. For most men, such words might have sparked caution. For Sutton, they lit a fuse. He wasn't going to wait for Estep to make the first move. Instead, he rallied 3 younger inmates, 23-year-old Charles Arnold Freeman, 33-year-old Thomas Street, and 22-year-old David Wesley Stuffle Street. Together, they hatched a plan for revenge. On the evening of January 15, 1985, the prison's steel corridors hummed with their usual echo of footsteps and clanging doors. But down one hall, 4 men moved with silent purpose. Each carried a knife, crude yet deadly, sharpened in the shadows of confinement. Their target sat inside his cell, Carl Estep, unaware that judgment was coming. What happened next was swift, frenzied, and merciless. The 4 descended on Estep, knives flashing in the dim light. He was stabbed again and again, 38 times in total. By the time the attack was over, the floor was slick with blood. Estep's reign of fear ended not at the hands of justice, but in a storm of blades driven by men just as violent as he had ever been. At first, prison officials struggled to piece together the bloody scene. Rumors swirled inside the walls, whispered accounts of revenge and drug debts, but formal charges didn't come until months later. On May 20th, Sutton, Freeman, and Street were each indicted for first-degree murder. Street, the youngest of the group, faced charges as an accessory. The case went to trial, the testimony laying bare the brutality of the attack. Jurors listened as the details of that January night unfolded, the knives, the planning, the sheer savagery. In March 1986, the verdict came down. Charles Freeman and David Street walked free, acquitted of the charges. Thomas Street was sentenced to life in prison, and Nicholas Todd Sutton, already serving life for his earlier killings, was condemned once more. This time, the punishment would be final. He was sentenced to death. With that decision, Sutton's path was set. What had begun as a troubled boy from Tennessee had now hardened into a man bound for the execution chamber. But even on death row, Sutton's story was far from finished. Because in the years that followed, something strange happened. Nicholas Todd Sutton began to change. For decades after his death sentence, Nicholas Todd Sutton's life became a battle of paperwork, pleas, and prayer. From one courtroom to another, his lawyers argued that his childhood trauma, drug addiction, and later transformation should spare him from the ultimate punishment. They painted a portrait not of a remorseless killer, but of a man shaped by darkness who had somehow found light within the walls of death row. Remarkably, some voices agreed. At Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, where Sutton lived out his final years, correctional officers described him as a different man. They said he had become a Christian convert, a steady presence among the condemned, tending to sick inmates who had no one else. Stories even circulated of how he had risked his life during prison riots, saving guards from being killed by other inmates. His lawyers pressed these accounts hard. They pointed to his behavior as proof of redemption, evidence that Sutton had changed in ways prison was meant to inspire, but rarely did. And their arguments carried surprising weight. 5 of the original jurors who had once voted for his execution now supported his plea for clemency. Some of his victims' relatives even stepped forward, urging mercy. But forgiveness was not unanimous. Amy Large Cook, the sister of his murdered childhood friend, was blunt. She said Sutton deserved to die, and vowed to stand witness when justice was delivered. His uncle Thomas Davis echoed her bitterness. To him, Sutton was beyond repair. Totally somebody who shouldn't even be part of society. As the execution date drew near, Sutton made a choice that shocked many. Under Tennessee law, inmates sentenced for crimes committed before 1999 were allowed to choose between lethal injection and the electric chair. Sutton asked for the chair, a method long abandoned by most states, steeped in a history of sparks, smoke, and human agony. In January 2020, his final clemency request landed on the desk of Governor Bill Lee. After days of deliberation, the answer came: denied. A week later, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to intervene. Time had run out. On February 20th, 2020, the heavy doors of Riverbend's death chamber opened. Sutton entered calmly, speaking quietly with the prison chaplain who had become his closest companion. He requested communion, Welch's grape juice, and a simple wafer. Afterward, he was served his last meal: fried pork chops, mashed potatoes with gravy, and peach pie with vanilla ice cream, the kind of Southern comfort food his grandmother once made, now a haunting echo of the life he had destroyed. When the moment came, guards strapped him into the wooden chair, thick leather belts binding his chest and limbs. The black execution hood was lowered over his face. But before the switch was thrown, Sutton gave his final statement. His voice was steady, almost serene. "I'm just grateful to be a servant of God, and I'm looking forward to being in His presence, and I thank you," Sutton said before the executioner turned on the electric chair. With those words, the current surged. His body stiffened against the straps, the silence in the chamber broken only by the hum of electricity. Minutes later, the warden pronounced him dead. Nicholas Todd Sutton was 58 years old. His execution marked the end of a life defined by violence, lies, and desperate bids for redemption. At 7:26 p.m., CST, 58-year-old Sutton was pronounced dead inside Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. His execution marked a grim milestone, the seventh man put to death since Tennessee resumed capital punishment in 2018, and the 139th since 1916. But Sutton's case carried a dark distinction. He became the only person in Tennessee's history to be executed for killing another inmate behind prison walls.